Hi, and I really want to thank everybody for being here still and for the invitation to give a presentation. It's not only an honor to speak at a symposium honoring Dr. Fraumeni, but it's also my honor to represent the very active and large upper GI cancer research group that exists in DCEG. The title here is Polycyclic Hydrocarbons, a Unifying Hypothesis for Global Patterns of Esophageal Cancer, and this would have been a great talk if it had been given by my colleague Sandy Dawsey, but he's at his daughter's graduation from medical school today. And after talking to Dr. Fraumeni about this, I decided to take a slightly different tact. And what I want to go is into the background about why we have such a fantastic legacy of intervention and etiologic studies for esophageal and gastric cancer in DCEG. And then I'll come around to PAHs at the end. So, when I talk about esophageal and gastric cancer, we know that these are considered rare cancers in the United States, but in a global look, they are not rare cancers. They're the second and sixth leading cause of cancer death, and together they cause over 1 million deaths per year. So these are very important cancers for us to understand what's causing them. These are the four principals who led to the opening between the U.S. and China, but I prefer a slightly different picture, and that's this one of a meal with Richard Nixon and Zhou Enlai. I like it because Nixon doesn't look like he knows what to do with these chopsticks, and it also looks like he may have just swallowed a bug or something like that. He doesn't look too happy to be there, but it was great for us. And what I'm going to talk mainly about is the studies that were done in a part of China called Linshen. And this is what it looks like in Linshen. It's very dry, it's very rugged, it's very rural, and the people there have a very difficult time scratching out a living. And they have a very poor diet, and they have deficiencies in almost all nutritional factors. And those we think are very important in the risk for upper GI cancer, and it led to some very interesting intervention studies. So here's the map that Dr. Blatt showed. If we zoom in on this and look at this area that's in red for esophageal cancer, this almost outlines a mountain range called the Taihang Mountains. And in this area, the cancer rates are at least tenfold higher than they are in the yellow areas. And dead center in that is Linshen. And Linshen has a population that suffers from really extraordinary rates of cancers, and it may be the single greatest concentration of cancers of one type in any population. Now, the Chinese had been making maps and knew about this excess of cancer, and this is an article from the Washington Post published in 1980 about the cancer detectives of Linshen, and there was actually a BBC-produced documentary about Chinese work in Linshen that I saw when I was in junior high. And I was amazed by this story, and it really stuck with me because at one point in the documentary, they do an esophagectomy, and they bring the esophagus out and show it to the family, and I never forgot that. And when I came to NCI and was looking for a mentor, I was speaking to Sandy Dawsey, and he said, "You should really watch this movie called Cancer Detectives of Linshen." I said, "I've already seen it, and I'm really interested in this topic," and so that's part of the reason that I'm doing this work today. But the reason I bring this up is that the Chinese were aware, and they were really focused on nutritional interventions, but what they were trying to do was to reduce the intake of a certain type of pickle, and they thought that this pickle was really driving the cancer. The NCI perspective was to look at testing the replacement of nutritions through supplementation. And the people who led this work on the Chinese side, you've already heard mentioned, were Li Bing and Li Jinyao. And they took the lead in our collaboration from the Chinese side. From the US side, we of course have Dr. Fraumeni and Dr. Blatt, but also Peter Greenwald and my close collaborator, Phil Taylor. Now, there were two trials that were done. And these trials started back in 1985, part of the first generation of nutrition intervention trials. The larger trial was called the General Population Trial because it was made up of basically healthy adults between the ages of 40 and 69, about 30,000 people. And they were randomized in a somewhat complex design to one of 4 different combinations of vitamins and minerals, and this duration of the intervention was a little over 5 years, with the primary endpoint being esophageal cancer incidence and mortality. There was a second smaller trial of about 3,300, and in that trial the randomization was to a multivitamin preparation. Here's what the factors were, and I highlighted factor D, selenium, beta-carotene, and vitamin E because that's where the action is when we get to looking at the results. Now, I want to step back and talk about the audacity of deciding to do a trial with 33,000 people with 6 years of intervention in central China in the mid-1980s. And it sort of boggles the mind to think about deciding that this is something that we can get done. And this picture I'm showing are the empty pill bottles. So this huge drift is actually all empty pill bottles, because not only did they have to have a daily medication, all the empty pill bottles were collected to assess compliance. And so this is really a fantastically a project that continues to reap benefits for all of us today. Now, the primary results were published back in 1993. The trial had ended in 91, and in it, the findings were that selenium, beta-carotene, and vitamin E could significantly reduce total mortality, decrease cancer mortality, and significantly decrease gastric cancer mortality by 21%. And so this still stands as one of the few nutritional intervention studies that has shown a substantial benefit to the population. And that may be because they started at such a low status to begin with. But it wasn't just any vitamins and minerals. The other three factors did not have this effect. So it did seem that there was a specific effect of this intervention. Now, we've continued to follow the people in the trial after the end of the intervention, and a few years ago we published the results, and this was led by our current Chinese collaborator, Yulin Chao, and this is for gastric cancer mortality. The trial ended here, and that's where the intervention ended, and you can see that the people receiving the intervention had lower cumulative incidence of dying from gastric cancer than the referent group, but with 10 years of additional follow-up, that benefit did not go away. So this short 5-year intervention seems to have permanently reset their cancer risk and is benefiting these people for the long term. Now, I haven't mentioned esophageal cancer, which was the primary endpoint. And when we did the reanalysis, we found something quite striking, and that was that there was a quantitative interaction by age at baseline when the intervention started. So these are the people who were less than 55 years of age at baseline, and you can see that when the intervention ended, there was some hint of a protection, but it really wasn't evident. But with additional 10 years of follow-up, it became a significant protective effect. Unfortunately, to get null effects, that means that we had to look at the older people, and that's where we saw an adverse effect. So the intervention actually increased the risks of dying from esophageal cancer in the people who were older at baseline. Now, this may go back to something that Bob discussed earlier, and that there's been these critical windows in it. So it may be that these interventions can be beneficial, but it really needs to start when people are younger, and therefore probably at an earlier phase of the development of precancer. Now, as I said, we've continued to follow these people as a cohort, and just to emphasize how extreme the cancer experience is in Linshen, we have 33,000 people in our cohort. We've had 6,300 incident upper GI cancers. More than 10% of the population has developed esophageal cancer during follow-up. Plus, we've had about over 2,500 gastric cancers. This also highlights another unique aspect of Linshen. In Linshen, 75% of the gastric cancers occur in the cardia. The cardia is the top 2 centimeters of the stomach. So even with this large organ, we're having almost all of the cancer occurring in the very top of the stomach. And that's a pattern that we see in other parts of the world that have a lot of squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus. Now, we've gone on to use this cohort for more than 100 publications focusing on upper GI cancer and other endpoints. We've looked at the effect of the intervention on primary liver cancer and lung cancer. We've looked at a lot of different nutritional biomarkers, such as the concentration of zinc in the tissue or pre-diagnostic plasma vitamin C. We've explored Helicobacter pylori's role in upper GI cancer. We've done a whole series of null studies on HPV, because we really don't think HPV is relevant to the esophageal cancer. And we've also gone on to use the NIT cohort in our genetic studies. So a few years ago, we published the first GWAS of esophageal squamous cell carcinoma that included NIT subjects as well as subjects from the Shanxi Cancer Genetics Study and women and men from the Shanghai men's and women's cohort studies, as well as the Singapore cohort, Singapore Chinese cohort. In that study, we found something else quite remarkable. The single strongest signal for both squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus and gastric cardia cancer, those cancers in the top 2 centimeters of the stomach, came from the exact same location in the genome, whereas there was no effect for non-cardia gastric cancer. So not only were these cancers geographically similar in that we see them co-occurring, they had a genetic overlap as well, in that there was only one location in the whole genome that really seemed to have the strongest association for both cancers. Now, Getting back to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, this is a big facet of the work that we've done there as well, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to step back for just a minute and look at the global picture for esophageal cancer. This is from GlobalCan, and we can see that there is a band of esophageal cancer running from China across here to Iran, and this is called the Central Asian Cancer Belt, and it's an area where there's lots of esophageal cancer. And our work started in China. But looking at the work in China as a model, we've extended this to many other parts of the world. We've built a case control study and then a cohort in northeastern Iran where the rates of esophageal cancer are quite high. We now have a cohort of 50,000 people enrolled with extensive biosamples, and they're under active follow-up. And we've just about reached our milestone of 250 esophageal cancers where we'll be able to start doing prospective analyses. We've continued this with some smaller studies, some exposure-focused studies in southern Brazil, where there's another cluster of esophageal cancer in and around Uruguay. We also have just some nascent studies going on in the highlands of Kenya, where esophageal cancer is common. And there's something really extraordinary that happens there, where 8% of the cases occur in people under 30 years of age. We don't really see that anywhere else in the world. And it's not unusual to see teenagers with obstructing tumors in central Kenya. Our colleagues there have even seen 16-year-old twins come in that were diagnosed at the same time. And then we have some work going on through some collaborations in South Africa that covers the other part of this band that goes from eastern to southern Africa. Dr. Blott had already mentioned the importance of the rising incidence of adenocarcinoma and the importance of the early multicenter case control study, but I just wanted to expand on that with a brief note saying that the completion of this study led to many other studies of esophageal adenocarcinoma in other parts of the world, and Dr. Fraumeni inspired the formation of the Beacon Consortium. The Beacon Consortium is a network of studies of esophageal adenocarcinoma and its precursor lesion, and we're having our meeting tomorrow and next day, our annual meeting, and many of the members are here who helped participate in this original study, including Harvey Reish, Tom Vaughan, Wong Ho Chow, Susan Main, and others. And there seems to be some sort of a synchronicity between big events in Dr. Fraumeni's life and the Beacon meeting, because when he announced that he was stepping down from his leadership of the division, it was also in the middle of a Beacon meeting. So going back to this map, now I want to talk a little bit about our work on PAHs. So when we look at esophageal cancer in the United States, such as in this study where we use the very large NIH AARP cohort that we run, we see that cigarette smoking has an odds ratio of about 10. Heavier alcohol consumption has an odds ratio of about 5, and together these explain most of the esophageal squamous cell carcinoma risk in the United States. If we removed those factors, we'd have a major drop in this cancer. But if you can't go and look internationally and say, well, whatever causes the cancer in the United States, it's the same thing in some other parts of the world. When we go to Linshen and we look at cigarette smoking, the hazard ratio is about 1.3. Now, they have a slightly lower dose of it. They smoke less each day, and so it's a slightly lower dose, but nothing to explain this huge drop in the risk. And we also see that there's essentially nobody in our cohort that was consuming 3 alcoholic drinks a day, so that can't explain any part of the cancer. The same thing in Iran. We added hookah smoking because that's another source of tobacco exposure, and in Iran there's almost no alcohol consumption. And so these excess risks have to be coming from something else. And one of the ways that we've approached this is we've thought, well, maybe it's the same carcinogens just coming from a different source. And one of those could be polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Here's a kitchen in Linshen, and you can see that the kitchen is heavily contaminated with smoke. There's soot all over the walls. Soot gets into the stored food. And the grain in Linshen is actually contaminated with more soot than you would see in a charbroiled meat in the United States. And this is where they're using the firebox, and what they're burning is soft coal, similar to what we've seen Nat and Ching describe as the associations with lung cancer. They grind the coal into sort of a powder and form it into these briquettes, and they burn it in here without ventilation, and they also heat their homes in a similar way. Now, what's really odd is that there's very little lung cancer in this population. And so there's something, either a different cofactor or something quite different about the coal that they're using, because we don't see the excess of lung cancer. We've done some exposure studies. Here we have a volunteer. She was actually a member of a volunteer in the NIT trial, and she also volunteered to spend 3 days wearing basically an aquarium pump and filters for us so we could assess how much pHs she's exposed to in the air. We also had monitors in her kitchen, and we sampled her food and we collected her urine. And what we concluded is that there's just a tremendous amount of exposure to pHs in this population. The kitchen monitors captured about 10 nanograms of benzoate pyrene per cubic meter of air, and we had a similar level of contamination for the personal air monitors. And for a reference, a relatively polluted American city has much lower levels of benzoate pyrene in the air. When we looked at this across the course of a day, this translated to about 150 nanograms of benzoate pyrene, which would be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes. And this happened to be done on a beautiful spring week when people spent most of their time outside. You can imagine that on a cold winter's day when they're inside and using more coal, the exposure would be much higher. Now, moving to another part of the world, the area around Uruguay and southern Brazil, there's been a lot of focus on esophageal cancer in that area, and the primary agent that's thought to be involved is an herbal infusion called mate. This is drunk by many people. Very large volumes are consumed, and it's drunk in this gourd using sort of a metal straw. And it's often drunk at very high temperatures, and there's been a lot of focus on the effect of thermal injury and whether that could be driving the esophageal cancer in this area. And we went there to do some studies. We were suspicious about PAHs in Uruguay as well, and especially because it's gaucho country and they barbecue a lot of meat. So we did a survey of about 200 healthy people, and we collected information, and we didn't really find much with the making or eating of barbecue, but to our surprise, we found that people who consume mate but don't smoke have about the same median concentration of 1-hydroxypyrene glucuronide, which is a biomarker of pH exposure. And so this was really surprising, and when we looked at the volume of mate consumed, we saw a strong correlation between the volume of mate and the level of 1-OHPG in their urine. And so we went a little deeper. We collected 8 brands of commercially available mate, and we, in collaboration with NIST, we analyzed the PAH content of that mate, and we found that mate is very heavily contaminated with PAHs, and it probably happens when they smoke the leaves as part of the drying process. Across the 8 brands, they averaged 53 nanograms per gram of benzoate pyrene, and we thought that's a very high level of contamination, but because this is such a hydrophobic compound, we thought maybe it's not extracted into the beverage. So we simulated mate preparation methods by taking the leaves, adding hot water, pulling off the infusion, and we did this 12 consecutive times. And by analyzing those infusions, we found that 50% of the benzoate pyrene was actually extracted into the beverage and so would be consumed by a mate drinker. A typical mate drinker drinking about 1 liter a day would consume 200 nanograms of benzoate pyrene, about the equivalent of 20 cigarettes. Now, that's a typical volume. We do have people who are consuming 3, 4, and 5 liters a day and would be getting much more heavy exposure. Now, I've mentioned that we're starting to do some studies in Kenya. The area of Kenya where we're working is at high elevation, and so they keep fires going all the time, and this is above where the kitchen is and where they sleep, and you can see that there's heavy soot contamination. They're also storing their food in the rafters. The smoke actually helps keep their food clean because it keeps out the bugs and the vermin, but it's smoking their food, and so it's another source of contamination. And then there's a really interesting habit in the very local area where esophageal cancer is a problem, and that's the consumption of a beverage called mursic. Mursic is a fermented milk, similar to sort of a thin yogurt, but after it's fermented, they take a special stick, they char it, and they crush the charcoal into the beverage. And so it's about 10% charcoal by volume, and what you're seeing here are floating pieces of charcoal in the beverage. Now, not everybody does it that way. Some people leave out the charcoal, and so one of the things we really want to assess in our future studies is whether or not the use of charcoal in the mursic is a risk factor. So I've told you a lot of circumstantial evidence about how people who get a lot of esophageal cancer have a lot of pH exposure, but I haven't shown you anything that really would convince an epidemiologist. And that's partly because it's difficult to make this connection. The biomarkers for pH exposure are not fantastic when we think about trying to put them into place in the context of a low-income country study. The urine marker could be useful. It's a short-term marker, but if you're exposed habitually the same way, a short-term marker can be useful. But we didn't have urine in any of the cohorts that we had where there's a lot of esophageal cancer. But we do now. With our cohort in Iran, we collected urine from all 50,000 people, and we have that all stored away. And so as soon as we're hit the right magic number, we'll go ahead and we'll start doing urine marker exposure studies. But we do have one study that has taken us the next step towards showing that that PAHs are really part of this puzzle. And that was done using a case control study in Iran. We had collected about 300 cases of cancer. Everybody in the study who was a cancer case had undergone endoscopy, and we had tumor and non-tumor biopsies. So we collected the non-tumor biopsies from the cases, and we had a subset of controls that also underwent endoscopy, and we had biopsies of the normal tissue from their esophagus. We created TMAs, and then we stained them using a monoclonal antibody called 8011 that was made by Regina Santella. And we quantified the staining using image analysis, and we found a pretty striking result. Here's the main table. We have the distribution of the controls in quintiles, and here's how the cases were distributed. And that translates to an odds ratio of 27. So this is a pretty remarkable result. The real weakness is that this is still cross-sectional, and this isn't ideal for what we want to prove. And so again, we're looking forward to using the cohort to test this in a stronger study design. So that's the end of my whirlwind tour of esophageal and gastric cancer research in DCEG, and I just wanted to end by saying thank you to Dr. Fraumeni for creating the types of resources that allow us to come in and do all sorts of studies using samples that were collected 30 years in the past. Thank you for inspiring us to take this and go into other parts of the world. And thank you to the intramural program in general for the ability to pursue these long-term, high-risk studies in somewhat marginal geographical and political parts of the world. So thank you.